we're going to do a breeze through of World War One in Arkansas through World War Two, which will include World War One, the Great Depression, and then World War Two. Um, the reason we're doing a breeze through of it is because obviously the fighting wasn't here, right? So this is something that's covered in U.S. history and in civilization. So I want to focus on the Arkansas aspects here as much as possible. So in terms of Arkansas in World War One, we sent a lot of young men to fight in that war, and they came back connected to something bigger than most of them had ever had an opportunity to see before. I have a friend who's doing some research, and actually, she has I think it's her grandfather's journal. She's older than I am, so her grandfather was actually in World War One, and in it, he talks about the places that they are. You know, he talks about being in Rome and in being in France and all of these places he's describing them. This man had never been anything other than a poor farmer in, you know, the foothills of the Ozarks. Yeah, the Ozarks. Um, so that's what his father had been before him, you know. So this was an opportunity. This man saw the world, and in his, you know, each journal entry while he's in war, he's telling about um, how he feels about this or that, and how many people he knows who have been killed. Somebody who's sick because the Spanish flu was a big deal at this time, and he talks about, you know, people getting sick and getting well and some dying, and all of this stuff, this tragedy, interspersed with these descriptions of these buildings, these cathedrals, and all of that stuff that he'd never seen before. And then when he returns home, his last his last post in the journal was the day he got home, and it said something back in Arkansas, nothing doing. So, I mean, he had nothing to do that day. He was just going to sit. He was back on the farm. All of his world travels were over. And that was just so astounding to find, to be able to read all of these things this man had done. And then he came back and returned to status quo. But he did have that connection to a wider world that he would have never had before. So just a little background on World War One. It was sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in 1914. So a Serbian nationalist killed the Archduke. A Serbian nationalist is somebody who believes, you know, that the Serbian politics, the Serbian culture, the Serbian way of life is better than any other. And these countries were very close. And so this rogue Serbian nationalist killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Germany and Austria-Hungary were so close that they shared culture. So to say you were from Austria-Hungary, I mean, and to try to separate out Germany, yes, there were two different countries, but they were so very similar in culture and in language and everything that they really identified with each other. So Germany finds out about this assassination and pretty much spurs Austria-Hungary to attack Serbia to retaliate for the assassination. Germany says, you're not going to take that, are you? You're going to let them shoot your Archduke, right? I mean, I would let them get away with that if I were you. And by the way, we're on your side if you do go to war. And so they attacked. Germany was looking for an opportunity to expand. And so by getting involved in this war, they knew that it would push other people to ally, other countries to ally very quickly. And so pretty quickly, a world war broke out among 15 nations. 65 million soldiers ultimately lost, or 65 million soldiers ultimately participating, 8.5 million ultimately killed in that, and 21 million wounded in World War One. Some of the new weapons that were used in World War One included tanks, poison gases, submarines, airplanes were all all the rage. There were a few automobiles, but not too many because they were so new that they would have been more or less a problem to fix because there weren't enough mechanics who knew really how things operated well. So cars were still breaking down a lot at that point. So cars weren't as reliable, so they weren't used quite as much. But tanks were huge, and trench warfare, which is not listed on here, but trench warfare was used. So in trench warfare, people are actually shooting from ditches at each other in other ditches. So there was a lot of stalemate going on as far as, people shoot across ditches. Maybe they hit, maybe they don't. But no, there was no clear winner without an actual advance until tanks came along. And so tanks then could roll up right by a trench and shoot straight down into it, which would eliminate the stalemate at that point. Barbed wire was also used in World War One, which was one way to keep borders and to at least create an obstacle for soldiers. It didn't always keep people out, especially when the tanks were involved. Tanks were important because they could be used to roll over barbed wire. The French and the British were the two main users of tanks in World War One. Germany saw it as a defensive measure, and they wanted to be on the offense. So they chose not to use a lot of tanks. The president of the United States at the time is Woodrow Wilson, and he is very intent on keeping the country out of war. It's actually his second term that he's run for office, and his slogan was, he kept us out of war, because he did throughout his whole first term. So now he's up for a second term election. He gets reelected very easily with that. And necessity pulls the United States into the war. Basically, the threat of home terrorism was growing. And there was also the Zimmerman telegram, which was from a German general whose name was Zimmerman to Mexico, saying, hey, look, we feel like the U.S. is probably going to come into the war. How about you ally with us, and we'll take them over, and we'll both benefit greatly. So when that telegram was intercepted and deciphered, then it was decided that the United States really had to get involved, because in pulling Mexico in to be against the United States with that proximity would just be way too close. So on April 6th, 1917, we declared war on Germany because German submarines were still sinking American ships. In June 1917, more than 149,000 Arkansans registered for military service. There was an age limit initially in signing up. You had to be 21 to 30 to sign up for the military, but because we're going through so many people so quickly, they changed that age limit from 18 to 45, and then they were able to get almost 200,000 more registrants. So more than 199,000 registered after that service age was increased. So it went from 21 to 30 as the age to serve in the military to 18 to 45 in 1918. And that's why young men today register for selective service or the draft at age 18. So Arkansas's war economy was pretty much like it had been, cotton-based. Cotton was needed for a lot of things in the war, including uniforms, bandages. Bandages were really important. So the prices rose for Arkansas growers, which meant cotton growers from Arkansas were making more money. We also increased our mining operations in the state. So mining surged dramatically in terms of lead and zinc. There was a Helena factory that made rifle stocks, and they were really going and blowing too with the wartime economy. And there was a labor shortage because all of these young men who were enlisting in the military were, leaving jobs behind. So there was a labor shortage that people would have to fill. And those people were usually teenagers, women, African Americans who had not yet been into the workforce, that sort of thing. Camp Pike was created. It was named for Zebulon Pike, who was one of the people who explored the area through Jefferson's study of the Louisiana Purchase back in the early 1800s. So Camp Pike was named for him. It's now called Camp Robinson, later renamed for Joe T. Robinson, who was a senator in Arkansas. So if there's a test question, do any of the military facilities from World War I still exist in Arkansas today? Yes, even though it's called something different. It's still the same place, same purpose. 3,000 acres, let me go back to that, 3,000 acres that was purchased outright in order to build Camp Robinson. And they raised more than $325,000 at the time to build it. So Camp Robinson was a very important training facility for World War I. Ebert's Field was built in Lonoke County. It was Arkansas's flying school, which is pretty astounding if you think about it. Planes weren't very old at all. So the idea that you have planes, I think the Wright military flyer, is it 19? Let's see what year that was. Sorry, gotta look it up. The Wright military flyer was put into service in 1909 and known as the Signal Corps Number 1. So the Wright military flyer is not that old. It's less than 10 years old when we had this airfield. We're training pilots in Arkansas for technology that's less than 10 years old. Ebert Field was named for Captain Eberts, who was an early Arkansas aviator. And they trained about 1,000 cadets by the spring of 1918. So we had about 1,000 pilots roll through that school. And the first class graduated in mid-November 1918, just days after fighting ended. The field was decommissioned after 1919 because they didn't see a use for it at the time. So, yeah. Oh, there it is. The Wright military flyer was only 8 years old. I've got it there. Thought ahead. So, rallying people for the war on the home front, people were kind of ready for World War I when the U.S. finally entered, and that included the Arkansans, who are also very close to Mexico, right, in this part of the country. So people were kind of on board with it already, but there was financial support that was needed for this. So one of the ways that the country gained financial support was through the sale of war bonds. So Arkansans and other Americans would buy these war bonds that the way it worked is that you would give the government money with the plan that at a certain year they would pay you back with interest. So let's say I bought a war bond for, I don't know, $20. And in 5 years, I would get 25 back. So that's how war bonds work. It was a direct way for people to fund the federal government and the war. The Red Cross was also important. The first chapter in Arkansas was formed in Garland County. which isn't far from us, and that was in 1917. Women joined the Red Cross in order to prepare bandages to send. They needed socks to send and other supplies, blankets, and that kind of stuff. Black and white groups participated equally, not necessarily together, so still segregated, but there were both black and white groups that worked very hard with the Arkansas chapter of the Red Cross to send services and supplies to our soldiers. Colleges struggled to stay open. So the way that they did kind of keep their doors open during World War I, because remember, while women were eligible for higher ed, most of the students were men, most of the teachers were men, and if all the men are leaving for war, there's not much left in the way of a college. So colleges adopted an ROTC program usually to keep the doors open. So with ROTC, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but when you go into ROTC, if you graduate from your ROTC program, then when you enter the military, you can go in as an officer. So that became more and more important to people as well. There were some instances of resistance. Not everybody wanted to go into war. There were some draft evaders that were in conflict, and there was an armed standoff at Camp Pike. The soldiers went out looking for the draft dodgers. Also, there was a group called the Russellites, named for the leader of the Jehovah's Witness church, whose last name was Russell. There were 5 Jehovah's Witnesses in Walnut Ridge that were jailed. Some of them were tarred and feathered. Some were driven out of town for refusing to support the war. Now, these people basically were conscientious objectors, and conscientious objectors between World War I and World War II were treated very differently. So it's important to remember that these guys in World War I, the conscientious objectors, were looked down upon. They were literally tarred, feathered, run out of town, that kind of thing, or imprisoned. So they were not treated well for denying interest in fighting or not showing interest in fighting. We'll look at that a little bit more as we talk about World War II. There were German Americans who lived in Arkansas. There was already a good population of German Americans in Northwest Arkansas. In the Ozarks, they found that area to be very similar to the climate that they were accustomed to when they immigrated to the United States and into Arkansas. There were lots of like grape and wineries up there. So because of the German focus in that area, there were people there who were threatened and made not to feel safe, just living the lives that they'd already lived. They were clearly Arkansans at this point, clearly Americans, but their German heritage drew attention to them and drew threats their way. Subiaco Academy's radio was targeted. That's also in that same part of the state. A Lutheran pastor was threatened because Lutheranism is associated with Germany. German banks were renamed. There was actually a German bank in Arkansas called the German National Bank. So it became American National Bank in order to kind of change its publicity during this time period. 8,700 men in Arkansas dodged the draft. And either that or they later deserted. Did you have a question, Lee? Yeah, 8,700. Yeah. So there were some war heroes from Arkansas. One was Herman Davis. He was from Mississippi County. He won a lot of awards for his actions in France, and there's a state park named after him. Eugene Kindley was an Army Air Force pilot, and there is a field, an Air Force field, an airfield named after him around Pea Ridge. And then we had several people who earned different medals of honors as well. Those two are the V's. So ultimately, 71,862 Arkansans served in World War I in the military. 18,322 of those were African American soldiers. More than 2,100 died. And more than half of that, though, was from the illness that was going around. Like I mentioned, Spanish flu was really bad. Back during COVID, people were talking about how similar it was to the bubonic plague, but there was something since the plague that was really contagious too, and it was the Spanish flu. That killed more than half of the people who were in war because of the close quarters that everyone was in. You know, if you were in a trench together, you pretty much got whatever the person next to you was going to have. So a lot of people got sick from the Spanish flu. 1,700 Arkansans were wounded, 1,751 to be exact, were wounded. So the Spanish flu, as people came in to train at Camp Pike, if one person got sick, multiple people got sick. It's just like, you know, like we saw with COVID a few years ago. The best way to control that was quarantine, but with so many people coming and going, it was really difficult to get a solid quarantine. And so that disease got out of hand quickly. About 7,000 Arkansans total, not just soldiers or anything, but about 7,000 Arkansans died of the Spanish flu in 1918. And there were 3 times more deaths from the Spanish flu than from the war itself. And this picture shows everyone doing what we did a few years ago. They're wearing masks in public, you know. Everything old is new again sometimes. So the legacy in Arkansas, obviously Camp Pike is still around. It's known as Camp Robinson now. It also housed some workers during the Great Depression for the Civilian Conservation Corps. We'll talk a little about that as we talk about the Great Depression. Or you'll read about it as you read about the Great Depression, because we won't be covering it as lecture in class. The Red Cross is still here, still important. It collects money for helping people in their most horrific times of need. Sometimes locally, that's a house fire or flooding or some sort of natural disaster like a tornado, that sort of thing. They still very much help in war efforts. They're sent overseas. But here in Arkansas, 2 of the biggest things they did immediately after World War I was to help with the floods of 1927 and 1937, and then the drought of 1930 through 1931. So at the time of the Great Depression, Arkansas was actually in a drought too. So it was really bad. If you think about the flood of 1927 was huge and horrible. It decimated agriculture in the state. It takes a while to recover from that. And just 3 years later, then we had that significant drought. So Arkansas farmers from 1927 to about 1932, 1933 had a really hard time in the state. Something else that the World War I brought back, excuse me, is I've forgotten what pellagra is. It's a shortage of something. Let's see. Nutritional defensive niacin, vitamin B3. So pellagra was a shortage of niacin, which is usually found in like wheat products, bread, that kind of stuff, because there was such a problem with food shortages because of the war and the Great Depression and everything. And World War One, people were trying to send what they could to the soldiers, so people were eating less and less bread. Um, but it causes really serious symptoms that were just horrible. So people were dealing with that kind of illness as well. Do you guys have any questions about World War One? No? Okay. Let's look at, here it is. Nope, that's not it. Let's look at World War Two. So in between World War One and World War Two, I said we weren't going to lecture so much about the Great Depression, but I want to get us there. Okay, so World War One ends, and the United States is in a pretty good situation at that time because countries owe us money, and our manufacturing has gone well. We are self-sufficient. We don't rely on other nations. All of that good stuff. So things rock on pretty good. We roll into the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, where and there's a lot of money exchanging hands, and society seems like it's kind of catching up, and things are good in the 1920s on the appearance of it all. It's still kind of an overflow from the Gilded Age where things looked good on the outside, but there was corruption underneath. And part of that corruption is actually what's going to lead into the Great Depression. So when people have money, they're willing to invest in things a little more frivolously. Like, for instance, say maybe I buy more lottery tickets on the week I get paid than when I don't, or something like that. It's kind of that sort of thing that got us into financial trouble around the Great Depression, except on a much bigger scale. So people were creating these frauds, these schemes to suck money out of people. And there weren't any kind of federal agencies or federal guidelines set up to prohibit that sort of thing yet. Also, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company Corporation, didn't exist at the time that insures any kind of bank deposits that you got. So when the stock market crashed in 1929, people panicked. They went to the banks to get their money, and the banks told them, we don't have any money. Or even worse, maybe say you didn't have a lot of money in the bank, so you didn't really have anything to lose, but your house or your farm was funded through a bank loan. And those banks, because of the Great Depression and because of the money scare, were calling all of those notes due all of a sudden. So like today, if you buy a house, you sign a note for 30 years and you pay on that every month for 30 years until it's paid off and it's yours. Loans kind of worked the same way during the Great Depression, except that when a bank wanted to, it could say that your note was due all at once. So let's say you're 10 years into a 30-year mortgage, and suddenly the bank says, hey, times are bad. We need you to pay all of your mortgage that's remaining now, plus 20 years worth of house payments that people couldn't afford. So their homes were getting foreclosed upon. A lot of people were left homeless. So as we start heading through that, trying to work through it, the US President, Herbert Hoover, doesn't really do a lot to address the Great Depression. He leaves that to his successor, who is Franklin D. Roosevelt, who comes in and says, I don't know how to fix this, but I'm going to try. We'll just try some things. We'll throw some stuff at it, see what works, see what doesn't. And through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps that sent men into work to do community projects, like to build small bridges or to build schools or community rooms or rest areas, that sort of thing. It put people to work doing things to improve the infrastructure of our country, and so it worked. other things came about during the time of the Great Depression, like the Works Progress Administration that put even unemployed actors and filmmakers into work, gave them a way to make a living as well. So the United States was getting back on its feet after the Great Depression. Germany has ended World War I with all of the guilt, and they owe a lot of debt to the other countries. So Germany's still mad about the way World War I ended for them, and so they're kind of ready to get even. And the get even opportunity comes with World War II. So that kind of leads us into World War II now. And let's see how Arkansas is impacted in World War II. Again, we're largely agricultural at this time. We've been isolated from other world events because the United States really focused on recovery and domestic things, not getting involved abroad. They didn't want to get involved with the stuff going on overseas. That was true for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, just like it was true for Woodrow Wilson's administration. Nobody wanted to get involved in the bigger thing. So everybody just kind of wanted to do our thing and to get along. It didn't happen that way. So we enter World War II, and almost 200,000 Arkansans served in World War II. It was 194,000, there it is, 194,645 Arkansas men served in World War II. That includes African American and white soldiers. That's about 10% of the state's entire population. So there were a lot of people who entered military service in World War II. A little over 3,500 died in combat, and 11 Arkansans won the Medal of Honor, which is the nation's highest military honor. So women did what they did in World War I. They worked with the Red Cross. They worked on conserving and saving food at home. They were encouraged to grow victory gardens. Victory gardens were little garden plots that people grew at home, even if they didn't live on farms, just to be able to support their own family with produce and that kind of thing. The conscientious objectors, this is what I wanted to talk to you about before. I mentioned the Jehovah's Witnesses that had been targeted for basically standing up for their religious beliefs. If you look at Christianity and basically any of the civilized religions, you see that killing is not appreciated, for lack of a better word. I mean, in terms of Christianity, there is a commandment that says, "Thou shalt not kill." So people who were religious were saying, I don't want to kill. It's against my religion. World War I, they were treated horribly. Like I said, they were beaten, they were flogged, they were tarred and feathered, sent out of town, imprisoned, all of the bad things. But in World War II, we learned a lesson from that. Basically, World War I violated the civil rights of anybody who spoke up against going to war because of their religion. So, if we're going to pride ourselves on democracy and the things that we say we believe in, World War II's personnel learned a lesson from this and decided to move forward a little differently. They gave the conscientious objectors, who were called causes, COS, but they gave the causes an opportunity to serve in a different way. So you didn't have to fight war. If you were an 18-year-old whose religion said not to kill, you still had to register for the draft, but you could note that religious exception on your sheet. And so you would be assigned to do some other things like community service. And sometimes these people help take care of lawns for like people whose like the man in the family was gone and they couldn't take care of things at their home. Sometimes they would help out on farms for people. A lot of it was community service cleanup, just going through and making sure the schools were cleaned and, just all sorts of stuff like that. It still wasn't an easy time to be a conscientious objector, though, even though the federal government said, we've got to do better for our people than the way we treated these folks in World War I. We've got to do better. There were still people, within the communities who would see these conscientious objector work crews and they'd spit on them, they'd yell at them, call them names and stuff like that because, they felt like they should be out serving in war. So it wasn't an easy time, but at least between the two wars, the United States said, we've got to recognize what this is, and we've got to do better for people who want to have the right to live their right according to their religious beliefs. So they also worked in things like soil conservation, community gardens, and that kind of stuff. We do have in Arkansas, and did at the time as well, some communities that were based on Quaker religion or Mennonite religions, and those are known as pacifist religions because they don't want to fight. And the fact that those communities existed really made the government look at things a little differently for World War II. So the conscientious objectors did have some options in World War II. One of the things that we didn't talk about for a long time in history was the Japanese relocation centers here in the state. So when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, people become very, very alarmed by the idea that, there could be an attack on American soil. Technically, Pearl Harbor, technically Hawaii wasn't exactly a state yet, but, it was headed that direction. So the idea that there would be an attack on American soil was very troublesome. And the idea that maybe we should round up all the Japanese Americans and put them in one place so we could keep an eye on them seemed like a good deal at the time. So that's what happened. Through Executive Order 9066, the federal government constructed the Jerome Relocation Center in Chico and Drew counties and the Rower Relocation Center in Deshay County. And so those are in the Delta area. You guys remember what the Delta is like? What's the land like in the Delta usually? What is like? It's what?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to describe.
It's hard to describe. All right, well, so swampy, mosquito ridden, all of that stuff. So basically, they put these relocation centers in I'm going to say the worst part of Arkansas, but anyway, so they put these relocation centers there, and together they held about 16,000 Japanese Americans. So when I say Japanese American, I'm talking about people who maybe their parents moved to the United States, maybe they immigrated here, but these families that are brought into these camps largely many of them were born here, born in the United States. So they had been U.S. citizens for a long time, either by birthright or naturalized to become citizens. They hadn't committed a crime, but they're all rounded up. They have to give away or they have to leave behind any business that they've owned or any house that they've owned, any car, any bikes or whatever. And the military moves them to the Delta to live in one of these centers. They live behind barbed wire in these barrack kind of situations, which is really kind of ironic today with our hindsight to see that we were so worried that we allowed a stereotype to dictate what we did. So the idea that these people, because they had Japanese characteristics, that they must probably be secretly following orders from a Japanese emperor or something like that, you know. So, well, not necessarily the finest time, but it's what happened, you know. So life in the camps was defined by confinement, uncertainty. They lived in these tar paper barracks behind the barbed wire fences, like I made mention of before. Summers in the Delta are hot and they're more humid than it is here, which is just miserable. The winters were really cold because the buildings were really crappy, and there were little schools and newspapers and community organizations that emerged within those camps because the adults tried to find some way to continue some semblance of a society rather than being seen as a prisoner or captured. Despite this kind of imprisonment, thousands of Japanese Americans from the camps volunteered for military service. So a lot of them joined the 442nd Combat Regimental Team, which became the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. Army history. It showed that they were patriotic to the United States, which was really something brave for them to do, given the situation. And they wanted to show that they were there to fight for their country and that their country was the United States. Do you guys know George Takei? You know that name? A little bit. George Takei, I know him from Star Trek. He has written a children's book about his family's experience at Rower. Yeah. I'm going to show you guys this. If you can't see it online, I'll share a link for the online students. Have you seen it?
Yeah. When I was doing my people, when I was doing my presentation on this back.
Thanks.
Well, my father was.
Yeah.
You did actually screw himself about him working for the military, though. He was also, apparently forgot missed one. Apparently, many of them also wanted to get rid of.
Yeah. Okay, so we also had prisoner of war camps. So the Rower and Jerome sites were to house Japanese Americans in one place. So, and not just, they didn't all just fit there. There were some others across the country as well. But so the Japanese Americans are rounded up to keep an eye on everybody, make sure nobody goes rogue. But we also have prisoner of war camps that are in Arkansas in World War II. One of the largest concentrations of German and Italian prisoners was in Arkansas. There were 23,000 plus POWs in these prisoner of war camps. Some of the camp locations included Fort Chaffee near Fort Smith, Camp Robinson at Little Rock, which we know had been formerly known as Camp Pike, and a major facility at Dermott, which is northeast or southeast Arkansas. served as a primary holding sites for prisoners of war as well. Most of those prisoners of wars were engaged in agricultural labor. They worked in cotton fields, they worked in orchards, they worked in farms all over the state, just to be able to keep agriculture viable, not necessarily productive or profitable, but viable. We had a lot of munitions manufacturing in Arkansas too. Camden was a big one. The Arkansas Ordnance Plant, where artillery shells were made and other different ammunitions components. One of my favorite things about going to Camden, my husband's grandmother worked there just shortly after World War II, I believe. The munitions plant stayed open for a little while after World War II. And then there were other people who worked at these facilities that were in his family. And when I went to visit them for the first time, I noticed that a lot of the family members had this little similar planter in their front yard. And I asked about it. It was like, is that like a family thing that everybody has these planters? And he said, no, but start looking around the yards on the way back and I'll tell you a story about them. And so the way back home that day, he told me those planters you asked about were missile heads that were created at this Camden munitions factory. And they weren't used for some reason or another. If it was defective, they couldn't use it. So people would take these old missile heads home and they'd stick them in their front yard and use them as planters. So it was kind of funny to see around Camden. El Dorado was important for petroleum refining and fuel production. Jacksonville was one of the state's largest employers for different kinds of production facilities that were needed in the war. And the Pine Bluff Arsenal was really important too, because this focused on chemical munitions and other incendiary devices. So there were more than 25,000 workers who worked around the clock in these munitions factories in Arkansas. Many of them were women and African Americans that were able to enter this factory kind of workforce for the first time. So the war effort in Arkansas led to a degree of prosperity from the devastation of the Great Depression in the 1930s. We were one of the poorest states in the nation to begin with, only hit harder by the Great Depression. But now, in 1943, unemployment was pretty much a thing of the past in Arkansas. Everybody had a job. Through those defense industries or through the different munitions factories and that sort of thing. For the first time, Arkansas was gaining industrial wages. They weren't relying on agriculture. So Arkansans started to develop technical skills and they started to learn the benefits of factory life, like that regular paycheck that wasn't necessarily dependent upon weather, drought, or flooding. Defense spending in the state was important because it helped to build roads and other infrastructure like bridges and stuff that benefited communities long after the war was over. So the economic impact was basically we ended the Depression era unemployment because of World War II. We set a foundation for industrial growth that would boom after World War II. And we had job creation across those defense businesses. For African Americans, the experience for African Americans and women who had been in the workforce during World War II, that changed back when the soldiers came home. But we do see African Americans entering the workforce more. Still very much a segregated society in Arkansas. Black soldiers who entered the war were largely assigned to separate units. Oftentimes, they were still led by white officers, and very oftentimes denied access to the same facilities or even honors or opportunities that some of the white soldiers had as well. So African American newspapers coined this phrase called double V. So victory at home, or victory abroad, and victory at home. So the idea was, if the African Americans can help win the war abroad, then they can win better civil rights opportunities at home. And it didn't happen as quickly as maybe people hoped it would, but it did fuel continued interest in pushing for African American civil rights. Also for women's civil rights, which happened later too. I mentioned Victory Gardens already in the war bonds, so I won't go over that again. Wartime job opportunities drew Arkansans who had been largely in rural communities into larger cities in Arkansas. It even drew them outside of Arkansas to bigger places like Detroit or Chicago or even California. Cities like Little Rock, Portsmouth, and El Dorado grew very rapidly during wartime because workers clustered near those jobs at those munitions factories. Farm population declined because of this exodus of these agricultural workers, black and white alike, who were men leaving for war, or if they weren't eligible for war, they were leaving to work in those ammunitions and munitions factories to help the war effort. So the victory in 1945 was cause for national celebration, but for Arkansans, for a lot of Arkansans, it brought economic anxiety. The whole defense structure that had boosted the state economically now suddenly might not be needed. So people were really worried about that. Veterans return home from war. They're looking to go back to their jobs that they had before. And, that means the people who were there generally were displaced to rehire some of those veterans back. When that couldn't happen, the GI Bill was there for the first time ever to offer college or training to these former soldiers to help them either find a better job or learn a new skill, or maybe even to help with home ownership through a VA loan. One of the things that in World War II, when my grandfather came back, he was given the opportunity to go to college or to take a class that would make his family's life better sooner. Because not everyone wants to go to college, right? So my aunts and my mom used to sit around and talk about how different their lives could have been if my grandfather had chosen to go to college and to, learn something different, have a different lifestyle instead of being a subsistence farmer. But instead, he chose the class that would make things better, which was pretty much how to build a better outhouse. And in a house full of 6 women, that was not the decision to make. So they still laughed about that for a long time. The defense industries started to scale back. Some of them closed. So there was a large amount of unemployment after World War II. But Arkansas did have that experience of being industrial for a period of time. So that was helpful for the state. Let's see. There we go. We'll wrap that up. See what else we need to cover here. Let's look at Harvey Couch really quick. There's not much to cover about him. Harvey Couch is an important man to Arkansas for a lot of reasons. And whether you know it or not, he still impacts your lives today. Have you guys heard of Harvey Couch? No? Okay. Let me find my slides here about it. Oh, which one? Six. Okay. Harvey Couch was a man who grew up in South Arkansas, grew up in Calhoun County, and his family had a farm. And so, like everybody else in his family, he worked on that farm. Then, as he got a little older, he started finding jobs outside of the farm. He worked as a mail sorter for a while, and then he got a job on a train. And he was actually sorting mail and stuff too. So he was actually able to see new areas and stuff, something that a poor guy who grew up on a farm probably wouldn't get to see very much of. One of the things he saw one day were these telephone poles. He said, "What is that?" And they're like, "Well, that's a communications pole. It's not a telegraph pole, but it's a telephone pole." And so he got really interested in that. Let me go back because I've got his whole outline of his career here. He was a boiler operator for Cotton Gin, his very first job, 50 cents a day. And then he moved up to a drugstore clerk. He worked in a drugstore as a cashier. And then he was good at that job, so they moved him up into a collections position because people could go charge things at the drugstore. And, when people owe money, there's got to be somebody to collect it. And he was good at that. Then he gets this job as a mail clerk. And the mail clerk job puts him on these trains. So that's when he's able to start seeing things, including these telephone poles. In seeing these telephone poles, he starts asking questions and learning more about telephones. And so he actually decides to get with his brother, and they decide to bring telephones to the area, Magnolia, Calhoun County. He wants to bring them to Magnolia. And so he and his brother established this phone company, and they put phone lines in Magnolia. Then they expand into Louisiana, and they start expanding, and they end up selling their telephone lines to another company called Southwestern Bell Telephone, which becomes AT&T later on. So if you have an AT&T service, Harvey Couch was initially part of that beginning. He also brought electricity to an area that's pretty well known in this area. It's between Malvern and Arkadelphia. Initially, this electricity only ran at night, but Harvey Couch's idea was this needs to be available all the time. So he used old sawmill dust that he could collect from local sawmills, and there were tons of them at the time. So he used old sawmill dust to create power that would run the electricity, but eventually he uses hydroelectricity. It's actually his hydroelectricity that makes him so important to Arkansas. These other things were small scale items, but Herbert Hoover had appointed him to a committee for Reconstruction Finance that oversaw public works and public works budgets and stuff. He stayed on the administration with FDR when he took over as president and got involved in the public works administration. And through that, through his connections with FDR and with Hoover, he starts seeing the possibilities for hydroelectricity. And so it's because of Harvey Couch that we have dams on the Ouachita River that create hydroelectricity for this region. Later on, after his government career and after creating what basically became Arkansas Power and Light and now Entergy, Couch went on to get involved in railroad again. He owned some railroad lines from New Orleans to Kansas City. He also created electricity for farms, which was another passion of his. He wanted to get electricity into the countryside, not just the big cities. So he did that through the Rural Electrification Administration, which is known as the REA. Magnet Cove and Prattsville were the first areas in Arkansas to get that REA electricity. And he also worked toward more industries for processing lumber and cotton and glass and bauxite and aluminum, which also become very important to the Arkansas economy. The dams that are used for power generation on the Washita River are Rimmel Dam, which forms Lake Catherine, and Carpenter Dam, which forms Lake Hamilton, and then Blakely Mountain Dam, which forms Lake Washita. And so these dams were used, like I said, to create hydroelectric power. Lake Washita was the largest earth-filled dam in the world at the time. It's operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, although it was actually Arkansas Power and Light that initially got permission to build it. He made lots of charitable donations. He created the Couch Foundation that continues to support charitable and educational cultural opportunities in the state. And it's through his leadership example, through his business interest, his entrepreneurship, that we have powerful institutions like Entergy and Southwestern Bell, AT&T today, and leaves a legacy of progress for the state.